Hey guys, tonight we descend into the clouds, not the fluffy kind, but the ancient, crackling mist of creation itself. You're drifting through a universe still figuring itself out. And let's just say it's not exactly a smooth rollout. The stars aren't hung yet. The earth is still stretching. And the gods? Well, they're not quite gods yet. They're ideas fighting to become personalities. Egos without calendars. Siblings without boundaries. You drift past swirling chaos. A dense soup of sky, earth, water, and night, all tangled in an argument about who came first. Spoiler alert. It was probably Night Nyx because she never stops watching. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to comment with your location and local time. I love seeing where in the world you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You float quietly as Gaia, the Earth, wakes up with a yawn and immediately begins giving birth to problems. First comes Uranus, the sky, her partner, who promptly starts smothering her children. And no, that's not symbolic. Parenting advice, that's literal. The Titans are trapped inside Gaia. And she's not thrilled. So, in classic early myth energy, she hands a sickle to her youngest son, Cronus. And what does he do with it? Well, let's just say Uranus never fathers children again. There's a lot of debate among historians whether this myth was meant as a metaphor for generational trauma, agricultural cycles, or just plain cosmic drama with extra gore trimmed out for polite audiences. Cronus takes over, claiming the universe like a CEO who's just ousted his board. Things go okay for about 10 minutes. Then he hears a prophecy. One of his kids will overthrow him, just like he did to his dad. So, naturally, he swallows every child his wife, Rhea, gives birth to. Zeus, down the hatch. Poseidon, crunchy. Hades, is spicy. Historians still argue whether Cronus represents the fear of time or the anxiety of every parent who suspects their teenager will one day roast them on social media. But Rhea has had enough. She hides her next baby, swaps in a rock wrapped in cloth, and gives Cronus the decoy, like she's sneaking spinach into a smoothie. Baby Zeus is raised in secret, some say, on a mountain. Others say in a cave with magical bees. And one particularly fringe story insists he was raised by a goat that could headbutt thunderstorms. Who knows? Myth logic. You, meanwhile, drift through these stories like smoke in a bonfire. The world is taking shape beneath oceans flatten. Forests stretch. And mountains start competing for the best views. Titans rule from their thrones. And humans haven't even been invented yet. The air is thick with possibility and petty revenge. There are no temples, no prayers, just feuding siblings, anxious prophecies, and the faintest hint of thunder on the horizon. When Zeus finally grows up and probably hits the divine version of a growth spurt mixed with caffeine and vengeance, launches a rebellion. Titans versus Olympians. Sky cracks. Oceans churn. Some say the war lasts 10 years. Others say it still echoes in thunderstorms. Either way, The Olympians win. They banish the Titans to Tartarus, basically the cosmic basement, and carve up the world like a board game. Zeus gets the sky. Poseidon takes the sea. Hades, with all the enthusiasm of someone who missed the coin toss, ends up with the underworld. Earth? It's shared. Like a living room, no one can agree how to decorate. You hover above Mount Olympus now. It hasn't been built yet. But the idea of it is here. A throne room in the clouds. Gossip in the halls. Lightning coiled behind curtains. The gods aren't just rulers, they're characters. Each crafted with human flaws, turned up to 11. You exhale slowly. You haven't even met them yet, but you're already starting to realize this isn't a story of gods who guide. It's a story of gods who mirror. They bicker like us, love like us, mess up like us. Only bigger, louder, immortal, and if you're lucky, a little sleepy by the time they're done. Zeus doesn't arrive so much as erupt. One moment, the sky is calm, and the next, thunder peals across the heavens like a god slamming the door just to make sure everyone knows he's home. You don't see him. At first, you feel him. That hum in the air before a storm. That weird static crackle when you rub socks on a carpet and make everyone in the room a victim. Except in this case, the static can level a city. You hover above Olympus, which now resembles a palace carved from clouds and gold. And there's Zeus' throne tilted, robe slightly askew, beard flowing in ways that defy physics. He's holding a goblet, probably not his first, and giving side-eye to the entire universe. You get the impression that he enjoys being in charge, but not so much the managing part. He likes the thunderbolts, the declarations, the drama, the paperwork, not so much. Zeus has a reputation, and let's not pretend we don't know why. For all his kingly duties, the guy has a hobby, namely, transforming into bulls, swans, golden rain, yes, rain, and pursuing mortals in ways that would definitely violate HR policies. Historians still argue whether these tales were originally meant to glorify Zeus or gently roast him for his lack of self-control. Either way, you drift past fresco after fresco of him, mid-transformation, and you start to wonder if there was an ancient meme culture we're just not seeing. But here's the twist. Zeus is also the god of law and justice. He upholds oaths. He punishes liars. He listens when someone swears on the river Styx, which feels, frankly, a little hypocritical, given his own history with honesty. Still, you watch him settle disputes among gods, mete out judgments, and even step in to protect strangers when it suits him. He is, in every sense, chaotic neutral in a toga. One quirky detail the myths sometimes forget. Zeus is terrified of his wife, Hera, or rather, terrified of what she'll do when she finds out he's done something stupid which, statistically, is once every 2 days. You float near the throne as he checks over his shoulder. Hera's not in the room and quickly mutters something about it being just a dream to a passing nymph. There's also this constant tension between Zeus and fate. He may be king of the gods, but even he can't override what the fates spin. That thread-snipping trio lives outside his authority, and you can almost see the worry in his eyes when their names come up. He rules the skies, but they rule everything else. As you drift closer, you notice his Symbolson eagle perched on the throne arm, a scepter inlaid with lightning patterns, and at his feet, a massive Yarsea de Chut, that jar. It's said to contain the last of the great storms. Locked away after the Titan War, he claims he'll never open it. He absolutely will. Zeus isn't all bluster, though. He also built order. He unified the pantheon. Convinced, read, strong, armed, the gods to follow Olympus's hierarchy, and was the only one who could somewhat manage divine egos, the size of continents. Think of him as a high school principal, with storm powers barely holding it together, pretending he's not exhausted. He once punished a king, Sisyphus, for cheating death twice, by inventing an eternal boulder punishment that's still going. He threw lightning at ships just to prove a point. But he also welcomed guests, protected hospitality, and honored oaths more seriously than you'd expect from someone who once turned into a literal cloud to get out of an argument. You ease back from his throne room as clouds gather behind his head, thunder coiling like a yawn. He doesn't see you, but you sense he knows someone is watching. Zeus always knows when there's an audience. That's half the point of being king, and as you glide past the marble colonnades, the walls echo with arguments he hasn't had yet, debates about fate, justice, and which of his children will inevitably rebel. You realize Zeus isn't a god of peace or love, or even wisdom. He's a god of tension, a ruler holding the sky together with charm, fear, and sheer, stormy charisma. You float lower, toward a smaller wing of the palace. Someone's coming, and she's not in the mood for excuses. You don't need to see her face to know Hera has entered the room. You feel it in the air, the drop in temperature. The tightening of the atmosphere, like the whole palace, is holding its breath. If Zeus is thunder, Hera is the chill that follows it. Composed, majestic, and deeply unimpressed by, well, almost everything. She moves through Olympus like a queen who knows she built half of it herself and barely tolerates the other half. Her robe glides across the marble floor. Her crown gleams not ostentatious, just deliberate. You drift alongside her, catching glimpses of her expression as she eyes the corridors for fresh signs of Zeus's extracurricular diplomacy. Spoiler: she finds plenty. But don't get it twisted. Hera isn't just Zeus's wife. She's the goddess of marriage, protector of women, and unofficial CEO of consequences. Historians still argue whether she was originally a mother goddess, absorbed into the Olympian system, or always intended to represent power filtered through patience and wrath. Either way, she's not here to play nice. You follow her as she steps into the Hall of Records where divine wrongs are noted, catalogued, and sometimes quietly avenged. The scrolls unfurl themselves before her, like they're afraid to wrinkle in her presence. She scans them, lips tight, who likely counting how many nymphs she needs to curse this week. That's Hera's thing. She doesn't strike Zeus directly. Oh no, that would be too easy. Instead, she finds the mortal woman, the child, the minor demigod caught in the crossfire, and teaches a masterclass in mythological vengeance. It's not always fair. It's rarely gentle. But it's calculated. You might be tempted to see her as cold, maybe even cruel. But as you hover closer, you catch her pausing beside a statuette of a mortal bride. Long forgotten, Hera reaches out, almost tenderly, and brushes a finger along the figure's carved cheek. It's a fleeting moment, gone, before it can soften her image. But it's there. Some say Hera never truly wanted her role as queen of the gods, that she was tricked into marrying Zeus, or pressured by tradition. Others argue she's the only deity who fully understands what power costs. Either way, she wears her crown like a blade. She wasn't always this closed off. Once, Hera loved deeply. The myths say Zeus transformed into a helpless bird, wounded, trembling, and, when Hera cradled him, he revealed himself and claimed her heart. Whether she fell for him or merely pitied him is unclear. What is clear is that from that moment on, she played her part. The consort, the queen, the avenger. A quirky fringe myth even claims she once left Olympus altogether, vanished to a secluded island, refusing to return until the other gods begged her. And they did. Because without Hera, Olympus fractures. She's not just the glue. She's the architecture. You glide with her into the council hall, where gods debate, squabble, and very occasionally agree on things. Hera sits at Zeus's left, not as a decoration, but as a co-ruler. Her voice cuts through bluster. Her presence demands order. The younger gods don't dare test her twice. There's something deeply human in Hera's contradictions. She upholds marriage, but her own is famously turbulent. She protects women, yet sometimes punishes them for crimes they didn't choose. She despises chaos, yet endures it daily. You can almost hear her sigh when another divine scandal breaks, outless out of shock, more out of exhaustion, and you realize Hera isn't just a goddess of marriage. She's a goddess of staying, of showing up, of gritting your teeth and doing the work even when no one thanks you. She's not warm. She's not flashy. But she lasts. You drift beside her as she retires to her chambera space of soft golds and hidden strength. The only sound is her earrings settling on a bronze dish. She doesn't say a word. Doesn't need to. The silence is enough to make the whole palace behave. You leave her there, surrounded by cymbal peacocks with their 100 watching eyes, pomegranates gleaming like secrets, and a single, still flame in the center of the room that never goes out. Because Hera doesn't need to shout to be heard. She only needs to be. You don't hear Poseidon approach. You feel him like a storm surge rolling under your feet. Even though you're floating miles above the sea, there's a pressure drop in the air, a salty tang on your tongue. And then he's there, stepping through a shimmering arch of seawater that never quite touches the ground. His hair is wet. Obviously, it's always wet. So is his trident, which he casually leans against everything like a teenager dragging a skateboard indoors. Poseidon has the kind of presence that says, "I'm in charge, and I will flood your village if you argue." He doesn't need Olympus. He has his own palace under the sea, sculpted from coral and salt-streaked stone, decorated with the bones of things that probably once had names. But he shows up here when he feels like it, usually loud, sometimes shirtless, always tracking seaweed onto the celestial carpet. You trail behind him as he stalks the halls, grumbling about minor insults. Someone forgot to invite him to a feast, or painted a fish wrong on a temple frieze. His pride is big, and his memory is long. Historians still argue whether Poseidon's moods reflected the ancient Greeks' love-hate relationship with the sea, or if it was just a way to explain inconvenient tsunamis. One fact's clear: the guy has range. He controls earthquakes, storms, sea monsters, horses, don't ask, and the occasional island uprising. One fringe tale claims he once tried to invent the first domesticated camel. It went poorly. Poseidon's feud list is as long as the Aegean coast. He once cursed Odysseus to wander for 10 years because the guy poked a cyclops in the eye. He fought Athena for control of Athensand, lost, because she offered an olive tree, and he, in his infinite watery wisdom, offered a salty spring on a rock in a city with no plumbing. Big swing. Poor delivery. Still, people feared Poseidon. Sailors prayed to him before every voyage. Merchants offered sacrifices before casting off. City-states built massive temples with wave motifs and marble horses, just to keep him calm. Because when Poseidon's angry, shorelines vanish. Walls crumble. The sea comes inland. You drift lower, toward the place where he's most himself's, his undersea domain. It's not gentle. The water pushes you, pulls you. Fish scatter in silence. The palace pulses like a living thing. Columns sway as if breathing. Sea creatures curl in and around the stone, eyes glowing faintly. There's no throne here, just a hollow in the rock where Poseidon sits when he's not storming Olympus or redesigning island geography. There's a sadness to it. Though, not all the time. Just in moments. You catch him staring into the currents, watching messages drift in bottles from mortals he'll never answer. He pretends he doesn't care that Zeus gets more temples, or that mortals paint his beard slightly too aggressive in mosaics. But he notices every detail, every slight. Sometimes he tries to be better. He helps build cities, teaches kings how to tame horses, sends gentle tides to fishermen. Then someone forgets to thank him, and it's back to whirlpools and sea monsters. Honestly, it's a miracle. His mood swings didn't get a constellation of their own. A curious fact: Poseidon, despite all the bellowing and tridents, once fell in love with a sea nymph. So hard he built her a floating palace made of pearls and whalebone. She rejected him politely. He flooded her village anyway. Romantic, in the most deranged mythological way. And then, there's his relationship with his brother Zeus and Hades. On the surface, they respect each other, but Poseidon never quite forgot that he got third pick. Sky, underworld, and water. Technically vast, but also wet, unpredictable, and full of weird creatures that won't stop spawning. You swim through a chamber filled with sculpted kelp and glowing barnacles. This is where Poseidon keeps trophy skunks the size of wagons. Kraken teeth, harpoons forged from meteorites, and, at the back, a cracked tablet etched with a language older than Olympus. Maybe his regrets, maybe his plans. Poseidon may not be the smartest or the most charming, but he's real, tangible. You feel him in every tide that lifts your boat, and every wave that flips it over, and as you rise back toward Olympus, the last thing you hear is the distant roar of surf crashing on divine stone. Poseidon reminding the heavens, the sea always comes back. It's darker here. Cooler. You descend slowly, as if the light itself is reluctant to follow. Marble gives way to obsidian, and the walls seem to lean inward. You're not falling, you're sinking. Gently, like a leaf into deep water. This is Hades' domain. And no, it's not hell. There's no fire, no devils, no pitchforks or pop culture demons. Just quiet. A stillness so thick you can hear your own heartbeat, which is awkward, considering the place was designed for people who don't have one anymore. Hades doesn't greet you at the door. He's not the welcoming type. You find him later, seated on a modest throne carved from black stone, draped in robes, the color of storm clouds. There's no crown, no weapon drawn, no thunderbolts tucked up his sleeve. Just a polished helmet hanging beside him, the helm of invisibility. Useful when your job is being ignored by everyone except the dead. You get the sense that Hades is used to being misunderstood. Modern folks love to lump him in with villainy. But in myth, he's surprisingly responsible. Stern. Yes. Unforgiving. Occasionally. But evil? Not really. He runs the one part of the universe no one else wants to touch, death. And unlike his brothers, he doesn't throw tantrums or chase mortals. He just does the job. Historians still argue whether Hades' gloomy image came from later Roman influences or from early Greek discomfort with mortality. Either way, his reputation always had a PR problem. Mortals feared saying his name, calling him Pluton, instead meaning the wealthy one. Because in the end, he owns everything that dies. And that's a lot. His palace isn't grand, but it's efficient. There are no glowing lanterns or drifting petals, just halls of stone, carefully organized, each leading to different parts of the underworld. You see judges scribbling in eternal ledgers, spirits whispering in queues, a bureaucracy so well run it makes Olympus look like a reality show casting call. And then there's Cerberus. He's huge, bigger than you'd expect. All three heads are awake, one growling, one yawning, one politely wagging its tail. He sniffs you, snorts once, and then curls back up. Satisfied, you're not trying to smuggle in a soul or smuggle one out. You step carefully around the puddle of drool that might actually be a river. Hades doesn't move much. He watches, waits. He's a god of patience. Eternity is his normal. Sometimes, you wonder if he's lonely. His only real company is Persephone, who splits her time between the upper world and this one. And let's not get started on how that relationship began. Historians still argue whether Persephone was abducted, coerced, or cleverly negotiated her own seasonal exit deal. Depends on who's telling the story and what century they're in. Still, when she's here, things shift. The halls bloom slightly. Light filters through in pale golds. This smiles more barely. But it counts. You once heard a fringe version where he built her a garden underground and filled it with glowing mushrooms and silent lilies that only bloom in the dark. Romantic? Creepy? Again, depends on your vibe. There's one chamber, tucked far back, where Hades keeps the list. Not a scroll, not a tablet, just a shimmering cloud of names, constantly shifting, adding, arising. Mortals born, Mortals dying. Mortals trying to sneak out of death with tricks and riddles. Hades hates those. He still grumbles about Sisyphus, that smug rock roller, and Orpheus, who almost got away with his wife. Almost. You float near Hades now, just at the edge of his awareness. He speaks rarely, but when he does, it echoes through the bones of the place. No wasted words, just quiet judgment. And, weirdly, you start to understand him. Not fear him, respect him. He's the one God who doesn't play games, who doesn't seek applause or temples. He gets the same offering every time, a coin under the tongue, barely a tip. Really, for managing the end of everyone's story. And as you prepare to leave his halls, something strange happens. Hades glances up, not at you, at something beyond. A thought, perhaps, or the end of all things. Inching closer, then he nods, almost imperceptibly. Not goodbye, just acknowledgement. Because everything returns to him eventually, the air warms slowly as you rise. Stone gives way to soil. Then, soft meadows. Then fields of golden wheat rippling under an invisible hand. You're not in Olympus anymore. You're walking through the breath of the earth itself. And at its center, brushing sun-warmed stalks with dirt-stained fingers, is Demeter. She doesn't notice you at first. Humming a tune older than any alphabet. Kneeling to press her palm into the ground. You swear the grain grows faster where she touches it. Demeter is the goddess of agriculture. Yes, but she's not some soft, smiling earth mom, sipping herbal tea. She's the cycle itself, sowing, blooming, cutting, grieving. Her eyes don't sparkle. They glow with the quiet threat of drought if you forget to respect her, and the promise of spring if you do. You trail behind her as she inspects the season. Her robe tugged with burrs and her sandals muddy. No throne, no entourage, just relentless care. Mortals knew her well. Farmers carved her likeness into wooden idols. Women offered first fruits, whispered prayers into the roots of vines. Entire cities built festivals, the Thesmophoria, for instance, where women reenacted her grief and rebirth in rituals still barely understood. Historians still argue whether these rites were fertility ceremonies, agrarian calendars, or coded protest against male-dominated myth-making. Maybe all three. But for Demeter, everything revolves around one story: Persephone. Heodota, her light, her ruin. You see her freeze at the edge of a grove. Something about the light has changed. It's that day again, the one she relives over and over. Persephone in the meadow. The earth, opening. A chariot of shadows. Hades reaching up. Not cruelly, just inevitably, the daughter vanishes. The flowers wilt. Demeter doesn't scream. She stops. Stops growing things. Stops speaking. Stops letting the world turn. Famine creeps in. Slow and patient. Until the gods panic. Mortals are dying. Worship is dwindling. Temples are empty. And suddenly, everyone cares where Persephone went. It takes a lot to get Zeus involved. He's not great at family drama. But this time, even he knows they need her back. So, a deal is struck. Persephone returns every spring. stays for half the year, and then goes back to Hades every autumn. The world blooms and dies in rhythm with her. It's not perfect, but it works. You float above a celebration, now a harvest feast. People dance, eat, sing. They don't know Demeter's watching, but she is. Always. Her hands stretch across continents. Her moods write seasons. One forgotten offering, and a vineyard won't fruit for years. She's generous, but never passive. There's an odd little myth tucked between the major tales zone that says Demeter once disguised herself as an old woman and nannied a mortal baby. She tried to make the child immortal by bathing him in fire. The mom freaked out. Demeter vanished. But in that moment, we glimpse something raw, her desperate attempt to make something last forever. You see it now, in her face. That ache, that old grief that never fully ripens into peace. She smiles as she walks, and flowers bloom behind her. But behind her smile is the soil, waiting, listening. You drift beside her as she pauses at a spring, scooping water into her hand. She doesn't drink, just lets it run between her fingers like time. Her gaze shifts toward the underworld, not with hatred, but resignation. The cycle is what it is. And somehow, that's the comfort. Everything returns. Everything comes back. Even the daughter, even the son. You feel the seasons shift around you. A warm breeze, a crisp edge to the light. Somewhere, a tree begins to redden. Demeter stands up, brushes her hands, and walks on. The earth exhales, and you follow the wind toward the one Olympian who never leaves Olympus. You find her in a hearth, not near Itenit. Hestia, goddess of the flame that never goes out, lives in the embers of Olympus, not in the spotlight, not at the front of the banquet, but always present. She doesn't have thunderbolts or wave tridents or helmets that turn you invisible. She doesn't need them. Her power is quieter, steadier, and vastly underestimated, like a fire that's been burning so long. People forget it's the reason they're warm. Hestia is the firstborn of the Titans Cronus and Rhea. Also, the first one he swallowed. And, by birth order magic, also, the last one, regurgitated. She barely mentions it. Typical. She never fights. She never schemes. And unlike literally everyone else on Olympus, she's never been caught in a scandal involving animal transformations, flying seductions, or dramatic revenge curses. You sit beside her now, the stone warm under your legs, the flicker of the hearthlight painting quiet shadows across the room. She's stirring something in a copper pot-knot ambrosia, but a kind of mythical soup that smells vaguely of rosemary and metaphor. Hestia doesn't speak unless needed. And even then, only with words that count. You imagine, Olympus sometimes forgets how much it leans on her, until she steps away, and it never happens for long. Historians still argue whether Hestia was eventually replaced by Dionysus on the 12-seat Olympian roster, or if that was a late mythological remix designed for more dramatic storytelling. Either way, she didn't seem to mind. She gave up her throne, by most accounts, willingly happy to tend the central flame and keep the divine mess from completely unraveling. Try picturing Ares in charge of hospitality. Exactly. She's more than fire. Though, she represents home. Not houses. Not walls or roofs. But home. The way a place holds memory. The silence between guests arriving and someone lighting a lamp. The echo of laughter in kitchens, long after people have gone. A lesser-known myth says that every sacrifice made to any god had to begin with Hestia's name. She wasn't the loudest, but she was always first. A sort of divine gatekeeper who never asked for credit. A fringe version of the myth claims she once walked every inch of Greece barefoot. Barefoot, blessing each hearth in person. It's probably not true, but you wouldn't put it past her. You watch as she glances toward the center of the room, where the flame hums brighter not because someone added wood, but because someone remembered her. A mortal somewhere whispered a thanks, maybe lit a candle, maybe didn't even know her name. But she felt it. Hestia's domain isn't war or death or the sea or sky. It's the pause between stories. The breath you take before speaking. The light left on so someone knows they can come home. Even the other gods, with all their drama and dysfunction, respect her. No one insults Hestia. No one dares. She's the one who would still hand you a bowl of soup after you've burned every bridge. There's a warmth in the room now that doesn't quite come from the fire. You realize you've been sitting here longer than you thought. Blinking slower. Your limbs relaxing as if the heat is flowing directly into your bones. She hums, softly. The melody's familiar, something older than lullabies. You don't want to leave, but you hear laughter in the halls of Olympus. Loud, chaotic, almost theatrical, which can only mean one thing. Someone's thrown another party, and he's here. You hear him before you see him. Laughter, not light and polite, but full-bellied and echoing off every pillar in Olympus. Somewhere, a lyre is playing far too fast. A wine jug crashes. Someone shouts. And then, a wave of revelers bursts through a marble arch like a toga-clad tidal wave. And at the center of it all is Dionysus drunk. Dazzling. And somehow not falling over. He's the god of wine. Yes, but that's barely scratching the cork. Dionysus is the god of ecstasy, of frenzy, of transformation. He's also, possibly, the only Olympian who truly enjoys being worshipped. While Zeus throws thunderbolts and Poseidon sulks in his coral castle, Dionysus is throwing festivals that make Coachella look like a silent retreat. You trail behind him, trying not to trip over a procession of Menache's devoted female followers, eyes wild with trance and wine. He's got a leopard skin draped over one shoulder, and a staff tipped with ivy and a pine cone. Yes, really, the thyrsus. They call it, somehow, menacing and festive at the same time. He flashes a grin your way wide. Unbothered. The kind of smile that suggests he knows you'll be dancing by nightfall, whether you want to or not. Dionysus is chaos in a good suit. He doesn't bring destruction like Ares, or judgment like Zeus. He brings the unraveling, the beautiful breakdown. He reminds you that underneath civilization is a pulsing, irrational heart. He's why people sing too loud. Why weddings get weird. Why, despite everything, humans keep inventing new ways to throw parties. Historians still argue whether Dionysus was a late addition to the Olympian pantheon or an older, outsider, god smuggled in from Thrace or the East. His myths certainly read like someone crashing an already crowded divine banquet and making it 10 times more interesting. He's the only god to die and come back. The only one who spends time disguised as a mortal wandering, watching, vanishing, just before the punchline. You follow him as he twirls through a courtyard garden, now pulsing with music and perfume. Grapevines grow upward from cracks in the floor. A fountain starts spouting red-knot blood. Just very enthusiastic Merlot. A satyr passes out face down in a fruit bowl. Dionysus claps once, and 3 more join the dance. But underneath all the revelry is something sharper. He's not just fun. He's dangerous. A fringe myth tells of the time a group of pirates kidnapped him. Thinking he was an easy mark, he turned their ropes to ivy, their mast to a vine, and the crew into dolphins. Playful. Yes. Forgiving? Not always. Dionysus is also the god of madness. Not in a scary horror movie. Way more like the moment you laugh so hard it tips into tears. Or the night you remember everything and nothing the next morning. His rituals, the Dionysia, weren't just parties. They were sacred theater, masks, transformation, catharsis. He blurred the line between performer and character, reminding mortals that identity is a costume we wear until it slips. Even the gods don't fully trust him. He doesn't sit quietly at council meetings. He might show up in a chariot pulled by panthers, or not at all. And yet, he's beloved, because Dionysus gets people. Their joy, their heartbreak, their need to dance at funerals. You find him now reclining in a half-broken amphora, giggling at something only he can hear. A vine curls lazily around his arm. He raises a cup toward you, but it's already empty. Doesn't matter. The gesture feels full. He speaks 1 sentences, oft. Surprising. You're not supposed to stay the same. Then he's gone again. A swirl of silk and drunk poetry. Somewhere behind you, music begins to fade. And before you can follow, a colder gust moves through the corridor. It smells faintly of iron. Time to meet the god of war. You don't walk to Ares. You brace for him. The halls darken not because night has fallen, but because his presence pulls the brightness out of the air. There's no laughter here. No. Music. Just the metallic scrape of armor against stone and the distant beat of marching boots that never quite arrive. He doesn't announce himself with fireworks. He doesn't need to. Ares is the god of war, and war is never subtle. You spot him near the edge of the courtyard, sharpening a blade that probably doesn't need sharpening. He's always polishing something's words. Grudges. His reputation. His armor gleams. Yes, but it's the kind of gleam that warns you. It's seen things. Smelled blood. Heard the final sighs of cities. Ares isn't strategy. That's Athena's domain. He's not about wise tactics or noble sacrifice. He's about fury. About chaos. About that terrifying moment when reason vanishes and instinct takes over. He's the god of that heartbeat. The one right before violence explodes. Historians still argue whether Ares was ever truly loved by the Greeks. He shows up in myth. Of course. But often as a foil. A blundere. Or a brutal force that even the other gods rolled their eyes at. Sparta worshipped him. Sure, but mostly everyone else seemed to hold him at a respectful distance, or an armed one. And yet, he's not as one note as the stories pretend. You creep closer, noting the way he watches two sparring ghosts in a training yard of smoke. Not cheering, just observing, measuring, waiting. There's a mind behind the brawn. It just doesn't get the press coverage it deserves. You think he'll ignore you, but he speaks. They always talk about glory, he mutters, are not looking up. They never talk about the screaming. Then silence again, heavy as a battering ram. Ares has complicated relationships. With humans, with gods, especially with Aphrodite. Oh yes, that story, the goddess of love and the god of war opposites. Right? But they were lovers. Passionate. Reckless. Magnetic. Until Hephaestus, her husband, built a golden net to catch them mid-tryst and displayed them for all Olympus to see. Even gods have reality show moments. But here's the thing. Despite the scandal, Ares never seemed ashamed. He loved her. Openly. Maybe the only soft part of him left. Some fringe tales even whisper that he once offered to renounce Olympus and live among mortals with her. She said no. Of course, too many mirrors down there. You follow him now, as he walks past a series of shields mounted like trophies, each one from a different century, a different culture, some still stained. You spot a round bronze one with a sun motif and realize it's older than writing. He stops beside a small marble statue cracked and forgotten. A child soldier, barely older than 10. Not a myth, just a memory. He brushes a bit of dust off the face. For a moment, his jaw tightens. Not all war is chosen, he says, almost too quietly. Then he turns and continues walking, his boots echoing like cannon fire. You trail behind, thinking of how often he's misunderstood. Ares isn't evil. He's the part of humanity that fights when there's nothing left. He's the rage born from fear, the charge made out of desperation. But he's also the silence after, the wreckage, the slow rebuilding. And when he finally stops, you realize where you area a chamber filled with broken armor. No light, no warmth, just the weight of everything he's witnessed. He sits, not to gloat, to remember, because even gods have ghosts. It's almost jarring. The shift in atmosphere, from iron and ash to perfume and silk. Like you've stepped from a battlefield into the cover of a scandalous mythological magazine. Aphrodite doesn't enter a room. She happens to it. You don't see her arrive. You just suddenly notice. The air smells like honey and sea foam. And everyone's posture has improved slightly. Aphrodite, goddess of love, beauty, désir, and also chaos. Not that she looks chaotic. No. She's radiant golden hair, skin like moonlight on warm marble, eyes that seem to know way too much. But beneath all the allure is the awareness that she can and will upend your entire emotional stability without lifting a single sculpted eyebrow. You follow as she moves through a garden blooming out of nowhere roses. Myrtle, a suspiciously symmetrical patch of wildflowers that might have grown from the tears of a heartbroken demigod. Mortals built temples for her by the dozens. Whole cities claimed she was their patron. Historians still argue whether Aphrodite was originally a Greek import from the East, possibly a rebranding of a much older goddess like Ishtar or Astarte. Which kind of tracks? Honestly, she's got ancient mystery energy in spades. Aphrodite's origin myth is, well, not exactly bedtime material. The PG version goes like this. She was born from the sea. The less PG version involves a certain titan's severed parts flung into the ocean and some very dramatic sea foam. Either way, she arrived, fully formed, beautiful, and already causing problems. Poseidon probably didn't know where to look. She's married to Hephaestus, god of the forge, but rarely stays faithful. Her most famous lover is Eurystheus. That Ares, which still boggles minds. Love and war, tangled together, sneaking around like teenagers with immortality. And while Hephaestus did catch them in a golden net and humiliate them, Aphrodite? She laughed. She always laughs. That's her secret weapon. You watch her now, as she reclines on a bench woven from vines that seem just a little too sentient. She's brushing her hair with a comb shaped like a swan. A dove perches on her shoulder. Two dryads fan her lazily while she muses about a mortal poet who once compared her to sunrise, which she finds terribly cliché, but also adorable. She turns her gaze toward you unblinking, amused. Most people think love is soft. She says, it isn't. It's disruptive. It ruins kingdoms. Oh, you remember Helen of Troy, whose beauty launched 1,000 ships. You remember Paris? Chosen by Aphrodite as the winner of the divine beauty pageant, in exchange for a favor he could never possibly handle. You remember the Trojan War. She doesn't start conflicts. She just nudges, and mortals do the rest. But Aphrodite isn't cruel. Not exactly. She believes in connection, in longing, in that exquisite ache that makes poetry spill from your mouth when you don't know how else to explain what your heart's doing. She gifts lovers moments they'll remember forever even if the love doesn't last. A lesser-known tale says she once fell for a mortal sculptor who was blind. He never saw her beauty, but loved her for her laughter. She gave him one kiss, turned him into a constellation, and never spoke of him again. Some say the stars still flicker when she thinks of him. Some say she doesn't think of him at all. Aphrodite's domains aren't limited to romance. Either. She's also linked to fertility, pleasure, and even political alliances. Love, after all, has a way of reshaping empires. You watch her toy with a chessboard now each piece shaped like a tiny god or goddess. She knocks them over absent-mindedly. Love always wins in the end. Even if it leaves some collateral damage, she stands suddenly, stretching like a cat in the sun. Her robe shimmers with too many colors to name. She doesn't say goodbye. She just blows a kiss into the air, and a breeze carries it down the corridor. You blink, and she's gone, and you realize your next steps will lead you to the one God who makes things but rarely receives the love he deserves. You're off to find Hephaestus. The air thickens again, not with smoke. Exactly. But with heat and metal and the sharp tang of molten creativity. You descend into the forge. And it's not some dainty workshop with polished tools and inspirational quotes carved into the walls. It's a cavern of chaos and fire, where the walls sweat and the stone floor glows in cracks. And at its center, Hammer in Hand, is Hephaestus. He's not beautiful. Not in the way Aphrodite is. His shoulders are massive. His hands, thick-fingered and scarred. He walks with a limp, sometimes dragging one foot with a hiss of iron against stone. But there's something compelling about him, something raw and real. He doesn't sparkle. He burns. You watch him work. Sparks fly in short. Angry bursts as he strikes the anvil again and again. He's forging something you can't quite name, part armor, part sculpture, part music. It glows with a light not entirely from this world. He doesn't look up, but he knows you're there. He always knows. Hephaestus, god of fire, craftsmanship, invention, and awkward family drama, born to Hera alone. Some say, others claim, Zeus was the father, but wanted nothing to do with him. Whatever the case, baby Hephaestus didn't meet expectations. Deformed, imperfect, unacceptably. Apparently, Hera threw him from Olympus. Just tossed him off a cloud. He landed in the sea, shattered, and was raised by sea nymphs who taught him how to survive and to build. Historians still argue whether his disability is a later addition to the myth meant to symbolize divine imperfection, or if it reflects something older, an ancient acknowledgement that greatness doesn't always come wrapped in symmetry. Either way, Hephaestus made sure they couldn't ignore him for long. He built machines that moved on their own, forged palaces, crafted thrones that trapped their occupants. When he returned to Olympus, it wasn't begging. It was with a gift so powerful, Hera had to invite him back just to escape it. You walk past shelves lined with his work golden nets, enchanted automatons, intricate jewelry that seems to whisper. Some pieces are practical. Others are clearly just for joy. He doesn't only make weapons. He makes things that last. That's what matters to him. His marriage to Aphrodite was complicated. Some say Zeus arranged it as a reward. Others say Hephaestus asked for it as a prize, which is already a red flag. It didn't go well. She strayed, often, with Ares, with mortals, with anyone who offered passion. Hephaestus, he responded like a craftsman. He built a trap, caught them in it, showed the whole divine court. Not his proudest moment. But underneath it all, there's something bruised in him. Not petty, just hurt. He wanted beauty to love him back. It didn't. So he loved his work instead. A fringe tale tells of a time he sculpted a woman from bronze, gave her voice and movement, and a name, Pandora. She was his gift to the world. And, well, we all know how that turned out. A jar, not a box. By the way, that's a mistranslation. Full of sorrows, opened by curiosity, and loosed upon the earth. Historians still argue whether Hephaestus meant it as punishment or as proof that even flawed gifts carry truth. He speaks now. Low and steady, everything breaks. He says, that's how you learn where the strength is. On. Then he reaches out and touches the piece he's been shaping. It flares once, then cools. Finished. Not perfect, but whole. You realize he's surrounded by machines' gears, turning, bellows pumping, wheels spinning, but he's utterly alone. And somehow, you think he prefers it? Invention is his worship. Creation is his rebellion. And as you rise, following a warm draft of air that smells like soot and starlight, you hear another sound. Feathers. Laughter. Footsteps too fast to track. Because Hermes is already on his way, and probably about to steal something from your pocket. You don't so much find Hermes as he finds you, usually 3 steps ahead. Halfway through a story you didn't hear the beginning of, grinning like he knows you'll never catch up. A flash of winged sandals whips past your ear. And there, he eyes lean. Fast. Ageless. Not beautiful like Apollo, or mysterious like Hades, but sharp, clever, and permanently amused by everything. Keep up, he says, tossing a coin into the air that vanishes before it lands. He doesn't wait. Hermes is the god of travelers. Thieves, merchants, messengers, and that guy who talks his way into concerts without a ticket. His temples may not be the grandest, but his footprints are everywhere. Every road, every deal, every whispered lie that tastes just a little too sweet. Hermes is behind it, or beside it, or watching from the shadows with a notebook full of inside jokes. You chase him or try Toas. He darts through rooms like a pinball. He swings by Zeus's throne to drop off a message, swipes a handful of olives from a golden bowl, whispers something scandalous to a statue that immediately blushes, then stops just long enough to wink at you. Historians still argue whether Hermes began as a minor rural god protector of flocks and shepherds before ballooning into this divine multitool of Olympus. But once he found his sandals, the kind with wings, obviously, there was no going back. He moves between worlds: Olympus, Earth, the underworld, without needing anyone's permission. His staff, the caduceus, is sometimes mistaken for a symbol of healing, probably because he used it to separate 2 fighting snakes once, and they coiled around it and became permanent roommates. Classic Hermes, chaos negotiated into symmetry. He's also the only god who regularly visits Hades without making it a whole thing. He's the psychopompa word that sounds like a hipster band, but actually means soul guide. When mortals die, he's the one who gently walks them to the edge of the afterlife. No judgments, no flames, just a quiet stroll, and maybe a story to calm their nerves. Fringe myth says he tells each soul one joke before they pass. And if they laugh, they get an easier crossing. Probably not true, but it feels like something he'd do. You follow him through a marketplace that wasn't there a second ago. Stalls shimmer with goods from every myth. Apples of discord, cloaks of invisibility, jars full of suspicious winds. Hermes sells nothing. He already has what he wants: information, leverage, amusement. People think I'm a liar, he says, juggling 3 glass orbs that may or may not contain minor weather events. I'm not. I just don't always tell the whole truth. He catches 1 orb, taps it, and it dissolves into a tiny rain cloud that politely waters a plant. The other 2 vanish. You're not sure where. Possibly your pocket. He's not cruel. Mischievous. Yes, but Hermes is the god you need when things go sideways. He finds paths in mazes. He slips through locked doors. He shows up at rock bottom with a shrug and a, "Hey, you want out of this?" A lesser-known tale says he once helped a mortal thief break into a templanade to steal, but to return something he'd stolen years before. Hermes waited outside, arms crossed, whistling. The moral of the story is unclear, possibly non-existent. That's Hermes all over. He stops now, suddenly serious. Everyone loves a hero. He says, but the trickster? He's the one who makes the story move. Then he grins again. And he's off through a wall, onto the wind, 2 away before you can ask another question, and you're left blinking in a silent chamber. One that smells like sunlight and scrolls. Because your next encounter is with someone who doesn't move fast, but always moves with purpose. The golden god with the golden plans. Apollo is waiting. You don't walk into Apollo's space, you glide. Or at least, the space makes you glide. The floor reflects like polished bronze. Harps play themselves in some unseen corner. The scent of laurel and sun-warmed cedar lingers like a memory you didn't know you had. And in the center, bathed in a wash of light that seems to follow him even indoors, sits Apollo, god of the sun. Music, prophecy, healing, poetry, archery, and being generally exhausting in his perfection. He doesn't speak at first, just looks up from the golden lyre he's tuning. Gives you the kind of nod that makes you question your self-worth, and returns to humming a melody that probably hasn't been invented yet. Everything about him is deliberate, every movement rehearsed without seeming practiced, like he was born knowing how to pose for statues. Apollo is Zeus's golden boy literally, twin brother of Artemis, favored by the muses, sought after by mortals and gods alike. But for all his brilliance, there's something sharp about him. You wouldn't call him warm. Exactly. He's more like the sun, it's beautiful from a distance, overwhelming up close. Historians still argue whether Apollo's image as a god of balance and reason was a later development, tacked on by philosophers who wanted him to be a poster child for their ideals. Earlier versions of Apollo were far less polished, more vengeful, more chaotic, more deeply flawed. Take, for example, the time he fell in love with the nymph Daphne. She wasn't interested. He chased her. She prayed to escape, and the gods turned her into a laurel tree. Apollo, undeterred, made the laurel his sacred plant. A move equal parts poetic and slightly obsessive. You sit beside him now, careful not to touch anything that looks like it belongs in a museum. He tells you about the oracle of Delphi's shrine, his priestess, his sacred link to the future. Mortals traveled for weeks to hear the vague riddles uttered in trance. Sometimes true, sometimes confusing, always powerful. Some scholars debate whether the priestesses were actually inhaling intoxicating gases from underground fissures, which, in fairness, might explain a lot. Apollo's domains are vast. He brings light to the world every morning. He inspires poets. He heals the sick. And, occasionally, he ruins lives. His arrows can bring plague as easily as they bring protection. You ask if that's contradictory. He doesn't answer. He just plays a single note on the lyre that says more than words. A fringe myth tells of the time he tried to raise a mortal from the dead. He failed. The balance of life and death wasn't his to command. And for once, perfection couldn't win. He broke the lyre that day. Then made a better one. That's Apollo. Never rests. Never accepts a flaw. Maybe never forgives himself either. He finally turns to you. Eyes golden and steady. Everyone wants clarity, he says, but most can't bear to see too much light. Then he stands, hands you a laurel leaf, and gestures upward. You follow his gaze to the sky, and there she is, a bow slung over her shoulder. Eyes like silver moons, Artemis. The huntress walks alone. And she does not wait. You feel her before you see her attention in the air like a bow drawn tight. The temperature drops. The wind sharpens. You're not sure if the silver gleam ahead is moonlight or arrowhead. Then she steps from the trees that shouldn't be growing here. And suddenly the gods don't seem so distant anymore. Artemis is wilderness embodied. No throne room. No palace. Just a pine-scented clearing where your heartbeat starts to match the rhythm of hooves on soil. She's younger than her twin, Apollo. But there's nothing soft about her. She's fast, focused, and not here to explain herself. You take a step forward and stop. She notices. Of course. She sees everything. A deer bolts across the path. And she doesn't flinch. Just watches. Tracks. Breathes with the world like she was never separate from it. Artemis is the goddess of the hunt. The moon. Childbirth. And sudden death. A complexe résumé. And she's fiercely, famously, independent. Zeus granted her a wish when she was a chilled eternal virginity. Freedom from marriage. And 1,000 nymphs to run with. She got what she asked for. And then some. Historians still argue whether Artemis's image as a virgin huntress was originally linked to older, more maternal goddesses from Anatolia and Crete. There's evidence that her cult absorbed local deities, reshaping her into this paradox of purity and predator. But no one doubts her power. Even the other gods tread lightly around her. She walks beside you now, her bow slung casually over her shoulder. But the air still crackles with potential. She's not wearing a crown or trailing silk. She's in a short tunic, practical sandals, and smells faintly of moss and lightning. You try to ask her about Actaeon the hunter who stumbled upon her bathing and was transformed into a stag, torn apart by his own hounds. Hairjaw tightens. Not with guilt, with precision. She doesn't apologize for justice, only for mercy. Another story bubbles up. Orion, the giant hunter she may or may not have loved. Some say he tried to force himself on her, and she killed him. Others say they were close, and Apollo tricked her into shooting him from a distance. A test of skill. A cruel game. No one agrees. That's Artemis for you. Always a little out of reach. Like moonlight on water. She stops, suddenly, and raises a hand. You freeze. Not out of fear, but instinct. Something rustles nearby. Another mortal might have panicked. You just wait. Then she smiles a rare. Brief. Feral grinned, the tension melts. You're learning? she says. Artemis isn't chaos like Dionysus, or fury like Ares, or intellect like Athena. She's instinct, precision, the part of you that survives in the dark, the part that hears a twig snap and knows which way to run, or not run at all. A lesser-known myth says she once helped a young girl escape an arranged marriage by turning her into a bear. The girl lived wild and free for years. Then, as the myth goes, the gods couldn't leave well enough alone and turned her into a constellation. That's the tragic pattern, isn't it? Escape rarely lasts. But Artemis always trees. She leads you to the edge of a cliff. The moon glows behind her. She doesn't say goodbye, just nods once and vanishes like mist. Behind you now is a whisper of olive branches, scrolls, and logic. Athena is waiting, and she has thoughts. You step into stillness. Not silence. There are sounds. Yes, but everything here seems arranged with such care that it feels deliberate. A fountain trickles in metered rhythm. Wind rustles olive leaves in a pattern too precise to be random. You've entered the domain of thought, of calculation, of vision, forged through discipline. And in the middle of it all, Athena stands not poised like she's trying, but like she simply is. She wears armor, but it's ceremonial. Elegant bronze, chased with patterns that look suspiciously like battle plans. Her spear rests by her side, untouched. You doubt she needs to lift it often. Athena wins wars before they begin. She meets your eyes without flinching. You don't feel small under her gaze. You feel examined. Way ahead. Like she's already predicted what you'll say 3 responses ahead. Athena, goddess of wisdom, strategy, crafts, justice, and heroic endeavor. Daughter of Zeus, but not born in the usual way. According to the story, she sprang fully formed from his forehead after he had a headache like a brainchild taken literally. Fringe scholars love debating whether this myth symbolizes a male-dominated society trying to co-opt feminine power, or if it's an echo of older matriarchal myths. Historians still argue whether Athena's virgin status was meant to signal chastity or independence or something else entirely. She walks with you now. Every step evenly spaced, measured. Her owl flutters nearby, landing on a column that wasn't there a moment ago. The bird blinks at you like it knows calculus. You pass by a tapestry woven with scenes from mortal history, battles won through guile, cities built on philosophy, inventions sparked by necessity. In every panel, Athena appears not as a conqueror, but as a guide. She doesn't rule from a throne. She kneels by inventors, stands beside generals, hovers near lawmakers. She is present, not overpowering, and yet, she's not soft. You ask her about Arachne, the mortal who dared challenge her in weaving. Athena tried to warn her. Arachne didn't back down. Her tapestry was too perfect, too boldened. It mocked the gods. Athena snapped. She didn't just punish the hubris, transformed it. Arachne became a spider, cursed to weave forever. A lesson in pride, or in divine insecurity. Depends who you ask. You notice a model of a city nearby white stone. Gleaming towers. Open-air theaters. Athens. Of course. Named for her, after a contest with Poseidon. He offered a salt spring. She offered an olive tree. Guess which one people actually wanted? She touches the model gently. They forget. She murmurs. That piece requires planning too. Athena isn't flashy. She doesn't crave devotion. But she commands respect, like gravity commands objects. Mortals don't fall at her feet. They stand taller in her presence. Hoping to be worthy, you walk with her through an echoing hall, lined with spears that never needed to be thrown. Her shield leans against a wall. In its center is the face of Medusa, not as gory as you expected. Just sad. Historians still argue whether Athena helped Medusa or used her. That myth's messy. They usually are. She stops at a stone desk covered in scrolls. Chess pieces. Mechanical sketches. She looks at you. Emotion can't be ignored. She says, but it must serve reason, not rule it. And with that, she returns to her work, already deep in thought. Solving problems the rest of Olympus hasn't even noticed yet. You leave quietly. The scent of olive oil and parchment clinging to your clothes. And ahead, somewhere near the crashing edge of existence, wet Poseidon, the sea god, does not do stillness. The ground vibrates before you hear anything. A low, rhythmic thump, like distant thunder or waves battering some unlucky cliff. Then comes the scent, salt, brine, the sour tang of seaweed, sun-dried on rock. You squint into the fog curling through an archway of coral-studded stone. And then you hear a voice laughing loud enough to shake barnacles off Olympus. Poseidon doesn't do subtle. You step into his domain, and it's like walking into the breath of the ocean itself. The floor is slick with seawater that somehow doesn't wet your feet. Every surface glistens with impossible fish-scale shimmer. A seahorse, the size of a lion, watches you from behind a pillar. Somewhere overhead, gulls scream like they've been cast in a tragedy they didn't audition for, and in the center of it all, reclining lazily on a throne carved from black rock and white shell, is the sea god himself. Poseidon, god of the sea, storms, horses, and earthquakes. Older brother of Zeus and Hades, ruler of everything fluid and furious, and, judging by his amused smirk, fully aware of the effect he has on mortals, or tourists, or anyone with a healthy fear of drowning, he gestures casually, and the tides shift around him. No ceremony, just presence. He's the kind of god who walks into your house, takes a bite out of your lunch, and still expects a thank you. But weirdly, you do thank him, because Poseidon moves things. He cracks open islands, raises continents, makes horses gallop straight out of foam. You edge closer, careful not to slip on a fish that might be a philosopher in disguise. Poseidon chuckles. Relax. He says, I've only sunk 3 cities this week. You hope he's joking. Historians still argue whether Poseidon's origin lies in older pre-Greek earthshaker deities, maybe tied to bulls or earth cults that predate the Olympians. His association with horses remains oddly specific. He supposedly created the first one, either out of sea foam or earth and saltor. In one fringe myth, by losing a divine bet. You ask about Athens. His brow twitches. Yes, the olive tree thing still stings. He offered a spring that spouted salt water. She offered olives, oil, and peace. Mortals voted. A lost. Athena got the city. But Poseidon, he got the seas. And storms. And tidal revenge. He leans forward. Dripping beard full of pearls and menace. Mortals are fickle, he says. But they always pray when the waves rise. Oh? He's not wrong. Sailors carve tiny statues of him and toss them into the ocean before voyages. Fishermen whisper his name before casting nets. Even today, a part of you feels the echo of that reverence when you look out over the water too long. Poseidon is also, famously, not patient. He starts wars. He curses bloodlines. Just ask Odysseus. The guy took one wrong turn. Okay. Blinded Poseidon's Cyclops son. Details. And ended up on a decade-long detour. Poseidon held that grudge like it owed him rent. Still, there's a strange poetry to him. He's not cold like Hades or calculated like Athena. He feels. He roars. He mourns. He breaks. But not from cruelty from depth. A fringe story says, he once fell for a mortal sculptor who built temples no one visited. Poseidon flooded the temple one night, turning it into a coral reef, teeming with color and fish. No worshippers but infinite beauty. Now, as he rises an entire tide with legs, you realize he's been watching you closely. Land makes promises. He says, the sea doesn't? It just is. And with that, he vanishes into a curl of spray. Laughter echoing behind him. Your clothes aren't wet, but your thoughts are drenched. You step back into stone corridors, dripping with echoes, and ahead lies a dark, smoke-scented passage, one that leads to a throne untouched by time or light. Hades waits, and he already knows you're coming. You descend now, not in steps, but in atmosphere. Every footfall feels heavier. The air grows cooler, not biting, but still thick, like breath held for centuries. The scent of ash and something ancient presses around you, and ahead, a faint glow. Not warm, not welcoming. Just there, the path opens into a vast, obsidian hall, lit by torches that burn with blue fire. No fanfare. No throne of gold or peacocks or marble. Just a solitary figure, seated on a stone slab, pale against the dark, watching with quiet eyes. Hades doesn't rise. He doesn't need to. God of the underworld. Not death itself. That's Thanatos, but the manager of what comes after. Brother to Zeus and Poseidon. And, arguably, the only one of the three who isn't constantly making a mess. Hades rules over the dead. But he doesn't delight in it. He maintains order, keeps the gates shut, keeps the balance. Historians still argue whether Hades was feared or quietly respected in ancient worship. He had few temples, rarely saw sacrifices. Some say that's because he was unwelcome among mortals. Others believe it's because the Greeks knew better than to call on him without reason. You approach slowly. He watches you, not unkindly, but without pretense. He doesn't intimidate. He endures. His robe is simple, dark, his crown barely a glint of iron. His voice, when it comes, is low and dry like river stones underfoot. "I didn't ask for this," he says, "but someone had to take it." You believe him. He rules not with wrath, but with boundaries. Mortals cannot return. Souls must be accounted for. There are rules here. And while Zeus rewrites laws, and Poseidon breaks them and Hermes sidesteps them, Hades keeps them. His throne is a ledger. You ask about Persephone, and the stillness shifts. He did take her. That part's not debated. He brought her to the underworld, made her queen. But the nature of their relationship is far more tangled. Some say she was a prisoner. Others say she grew into her role, ruled beside him, even loved him in her way. A fringe tale claims she chose to eat the pomegranate seeds, knowing they would bind her, that she preferred power in shadow to passivity in sunlight. Hades never confirms. He simply states, she returns in spring. The underworld, despite its grim PR, isn't all torment. There are fields here, Elysium for the worthy, Asphodel for the average, Tartarus for the truly cursed. It's not fire and brimstone. It's systems, bureaucracy with mythological teeth. You wander with him through corridors of silence, past judges like Minos and Rhadamanthus, who still argue over moral gray areas like modern philosophers, past ghosts who whisper regrets, play out memories, or simply sit in silence. Some are grateful. Some don't even know they're dead. Hades sees them all, does not intervene, just keeps. There's a vault of Nemesis spectral archive, glowing faintly with every soul recorded. It's not scary. It's oddly peaceful. Life. Filed away. Remembered. He pauses by a gate, where the three-headed dog Cerberus dozes lightly. One. Head snoring. One. Head twitching in a dream. One head, definitely watching you. Most gods want worship. Hades says, I want compliance. He doesn't smile. Doesn't need to. He exists at the end of all things. Not as punishment, but as necessity. Before you go, he hands you a coin. Ancient. Worn. The kind they used to place on tongues before burial. Just in case. He says, and then you rise somehow, not by climbing, but by remembering warmth. The torchlight fades. The silence lifts, and you hear laughter echoing, distant and wild. Because Dionysus has been waiting, probably barefoot. The air vibrates differently now, not with power, or judgment, or logic, but with a kind of giddy chaos that makes your skin hum. Music swells somewhere nearby, though you can't see any instruments. The scent of ripe grapes, myrrh, and bonfire smoke weaves through the air like a teasing finger. You follow it into a thicket of ivy and find him sprawled across a mossy ledge. One sandal on, one missing. A wine cup sloshing lazily in his grip. Dionysus smiles like he's been expecting you since forever and just didn't feel like getting up. God of wine, ecstasy, fertility, madness, theater, and rebellion in its finest silken robe. Dionysus doesn't enter Olympus like a noble, he crashes it like a surprise guest who is the party. And somehow, everyone's glad he came. Eventually, he gestures for you to sit. The earth here is soft and absurdly comfortable, as though someone asked a cloud to try being grass for a day. There are dancers twirling in the distance maenads, frenzied women of his cult, and a satyr plays a flute badly but enthusiastically. A tree laughs. You do too. Without knowing why, Dionysus doesn't demand reverence. He coaxes it, not through fear or sermons but through release. He strips away what society demands and shows you the wild thing underneath. He can be beautiful, terrifying, liberating, and absolutely out of his divine mind. Historians still argue whether Dionysus was originally a foreign god imported from Thrace or Asia Minor and awkwardly grafted onto the Olympian family tree. Some even say he came later than the others, barging in with his wineskin and his ambiguity, demanding a seat and refusing to leave. The myth's wild and inconsistent sort of support this. He returns, goes mad, goes sane, changes form, changes gender, blesses crops, drives people insane. He is flux incarnate. He tells you a story. Or maybe he sings. It's hard to tell. Once, they say, he was kidnapped by pirates. They thought he was just some rich, delicate mortal, so they tied him up. The ropes wouldn't hold. Vines erupted from the deck. Wine poured from the mast. The sailors panicked and jumped overboard, turning into dolphins. Dionysus just laughed and kept sailing. A fringe myth claims he once replaced all the scrolls in a philosopher's library with hand mirrors, saying, "Now you'll really see the truth." Possibly made up. Possibly not. He passes you the wine cup. You hesitate. He raises an eyebrow. It's not about the wine. It never is. It's about what you let go of when you drink it. You take a sip. It tastes like every moment you ever laughed too hard in the wrong place at the wrong time, and somehow made it better. Dionysus reclines again, eyes half-lidded. Order is a mask? He says, but madness tells the truth. You don't feel threatened. You feel loosened. Like your bones remember dancing. Like your voice might sing without permission. And as you rise, gently buzzed with something far deeper than alcohol, you realize he's smiling not at you, but with you, as if to say, "Welcome back." Oh, you follow a winding path of flickering torches now. Flame colors shifting between lavender and gold. The laughter fades, and the air grows still again, but not silent. There is one last Olympian, the oldest, the first, and she has waited long enough. The road quiets now, not from fear or reverence, but from a kind of homecoming hush. You walk across flat, warm stones that feel like hearth tiles. The air carries hints of baked bread, clean wool, and wood-smoke smells of somewhere lived in. Not grand, not dramatic, just deeply, unshakably familiar. And there, tending a flame that never flickers, stands Hestia. She doesn't turn when you enter. She simply smiles, as if she knew the exact moment you'd arrive, and continues stirring the fire with a staff shaped like an olive branch. Her robe is unadorned, her hair braided back. No crown, no lightning, No symbols but the warmth itself. Hestia, goddess of the hearth, home, domesticity, and sacred flame. The eldest Olympian, and the most easily forgotten, while others shouted and battled and turned lovers into trees or cows. Hestia kept the fires lit, fed the family, held the center, and yet, despite her quiet domain, she was no afterthought. Every Greek household honored her. Every public sacrifice began and ended with her. Before any prayer reached Zeus or Athena or even Dionysus, it passed through Hestia first. She was the gatekeeper of offering, the breath behind every whispered wish. Historians still argue whether her worship predated most of Olympus, a remnant of older, hearth-centered cults that revered survival over spectacle. She gestures for you to sit by the flame. No throne, no marble bench, just a wool blanket and a slice of honeyed bread offered in silence. You sit, and you feel your heartbeat ease. Here, there's no need to impress, perform, or even speak. You're not a hero or a visitor. You're a guest. Fringe myths about Hestia are rare. She avoided the dramas. When Poseidon and Apollo both wanted to marry her, she politely declined and asked Zeus for eternal virginity, instead not for purity's sake, but for independence. She didn't want a story. She wanted peace, and she got it. While gods clashed and plotted, she lit every Olympian's hearth. She watched over infants' first cries and elders' last breaths. She was never in the spotlight, but always in the room. You ask why she gave up her throne, because some versions say she surrendered her seat to Dionysus. She smiles again, eyes reflecting the fire. A circle needs space to stay whole. She says, "Let him dance. I'll tend what remains." And you realize now why you saved her for last. Because she is the point of return. After all the storms, trials, monsters, and divine egos, it is Hestia who offers you rest. A flame that never asks for praise but always gives warmth. You glance down and realize your shoes are dry. Your hands are clean. And you've stopped clenching your jaw. She doesn't need temples carved into cliffs or epic poems sung in her honor. She only needs a quiet place and someone to care for. And in return, she offers something more powerful than any thunderbolt or enchanted sword. Belonging. You sit a while longer, letting the warmth soak through your bones. Then, with a gentle nod, she hands you a small bundle bread, a coin, and a sprig of rosemary. You're not sure what for, but it feels sacred. You resonate with reluctance, but with steadiness. You've met the divine in all its forms, wrathful, joyful, chaotic, wise. But here, with Hestia, you've met the center, and as you walk back through the now familiar corridors of Olympus, retracing your steps through myth and madness, one last breath of warmth clings to your collar like a blessing. Tomorrow, you'll forget most of what you've seen, but you'll remember the hearth. You wander the quietest corridor of all. There are no thrones here. No torches or ceremonial pillars. Just smooth stone, moss, soft silence. And the kind of hush you hear only in libraries or the moment before snowfall. It's not a palace, not a battlefield, not a temple. It's something older, something meant to last. This part of Olympus isn't shown in frescoes. It has no myths written about it. No hero came here looking for fame. But you've arrived anyway. Maybe because you've seen everything else: the thunder, the sea, the wine, the shadows, and now it's time to see what still holds when all the shouting is done. Your feet find a steady rhythm. The air is cool but not cold. A breeze drifts through, carrying hints of every god you've met along the way. There's Aphrodite's rose-petal warmth, Ares's iron tang, the wood smoke of Hestia, the salt of Poseidon, the soft echo of Apollo's strings. Each one lingers faintly, not demanding your attention, but still part of you, like a perfume clinging to memory. And then, at the far end, you find the circle. 12 simple stones, evenly spaced, weathered by centuries of divine indecision. This is where the gods gather when they're not hurling insults or sleeping with mortals. Here, they sit, they argue, they vote, they sulk, and sometimes they actually agree. The Council of Olympus. You take a step inside the ring and feel it immediately: the shift. The power is still here, echoing in the grooves of those marble seats. But it's not aggressive. It's not even alive. It's institutional. You're standing in the ancient version of a boardroom and a family dinner table smashed into one, which, if you've met the Olympians, makes perfect sense. Historians still argue whether this mythical council chamber was ever described consistently in surviving texts. Some believe the circle reflects democratic influence from Greek city-states. Others argue it was purely literary invention, a storytelling device, to make immortal egos slightly more manageable. Either way, this place feels final, not as in the end, but as in the summary. You think back to Zeus, flinging lightning and rules like he's playing catch with history. You picture Hera's calculating gaze, forever threading dignity through betrayal. You recall Demeter's grief, Artemis' eyes, Hermes' grin, Athena's silence, Dionysus' chaos. You remember Hades' stillness, Poseidon's thunder, Apollo's golden weight, and Hestia always there, even when she wasn't seen. And you realize something strange. You don't feel like a visitor anymore. Somehow, slowly, the gods have become familiar, not tamed. Not less powerful, but less distant. You've seen the cracks in their legends, the contradictions, the awkward myths scholars still squint at. You've seen how they mirror user wants, our tempers, our weird party tricks and petty family drama, but also our beauty, our poetry, our longing to matter. A fringe theory barely whispered even in the sleepiest of lecture halls claims the Olympians weren't just gods created by humans, but also reflections of humans trying to make sense of themselves, that the divine was never meant to be above us, just inside us. Larger-than-life mirrors for everything we don't dare say out loud. You walk the circle slowly, trailing your fingers along each stone. There are faint carvings, names, symbols, prayers rubbed away by time and neglect. No one has held council here in centuries, and yet the space waits, patiently, like it knows the stories aren't over. Like it knows new gods are born every time someone whispers a "what if" under a starlit sky. You sit now, not on a throne, but on the ground, legs tucked beneath you like a child watching fireflies. There is no music, no speech, just the quiet. After centuries of storytelling, you don't need to ask another question. You don't need to meet another god. You just sit, and you listen. And in that silence, you finally understand. Myth was never about the gods. It was about the space between gods and mortals, the place where we build temples not to worship, but to wonder. And that space is sacred. So now, let that final whisper of marble and myth drift gently behind your thoughts. You've wandered the stormy peaks of Olympus, spoken with gods who war and gods who whisper, and followed each one into a reflection of something very old and strangely familiar. Not because these stories are perfect, but because they echo through time, through dreams, through the questions we still carry late at night. Take a deep breath. Letting your body melt into stillness, let your arms go slack. Your shoulders sink just a little lower. Feel the warmth of Hestia's fire brushing your cheek, the steady weight of Athena's reason in your chest, the spark of Dionysus giggling softly in the back of your mind like a joke you almost understand. Don't worry about remembering it all. You've seen far too much for that. The myths will fade as they always do, softly, dreamily, like fog over olive groves in the morning. But something will stay. A sensation, a question, a new kind of quiet you didn't have before. Let that quiet hold you now. There's nothing more you need to do. No gods left to meet. No riddles left to solve. Just you. Here, resting at the edge of stories. Exactly where you're supposed to be. You're not lost in myth anymore. You're wrapped in it, safe, warm, weightless. And, as you drift further into sleep, remember, Olympus isn't some faraway mountaintop with thunder and gold. It's wherever stories still live. And tonight, that place was yours. Sweet dreams.